Jenny, this is the first in a series of films which is going to look at one of the central figures in the Christian religion and in Western art for the same reason, because so much Western art is about that religious tradition. And it's the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ. And we're going to explore some of the meanings that she's had for so many people over the centuries. And we're here in Berlin, and we'll be able to tell her story with the help of some wonderful works of art, some of them here in the Gemäldegalerie, which is one of the great collections of paintings in the world, and also at the Bode-Museum on the other side of Berlin, where we have one of the greatest sculptural collections in the world. One of the things that's perhaps rather surprising is that the Christian New Testament itself, and above all the four gospel accounts, which are the four accounts of Jesus' life, have relatively little on this figure, despite the fact that she's so important in later Christian tradition. Only two of them include accounts of Jesus' birth, and of course Mary's very important in that. But the other two have very few mentions of her at all. So there have grown up legends, apocryphal stories and texts that Christians have written to sort of fill out that story, to fill in the gaps. And those, together with the gospel accounts, have been what have influenced so many artists as they try and imagine the story of her life.
Yes, and what we're looking at here is an exquisite altarpiece by a Netherlandish artist called Rogier van der Weyden, who's painting it in the 1440s for a very illustrious patron, King Juan II of Castilla. And we know that he bequeaths this to the Charterhouse of Miraflores near Burgos in Spain. So this altarpiece has come to be known as the Miraflores altarpiece. And as you say, these separate scenes that he's represented, so one from the very early life of the Virgin, where she's just given birth to the Christ child, one where she's cradling her dead son in her arms, and the third one where her dead and then resurrected son appears to her. All of these scenes refer to events in the Gospels, but are actually drawn from apocryphal sources. And the key apocryphal sources for so many artists that fill in these events in the Virgin's life date back some as early as the 2nd century, one called the Proto-Evangelium of James. There's a 7th century work called the Proto-Gospel of Matthew. And conveniently, a lot of these apocryphal sources were gathered together in the 13th century in something called the Golden Legend. So many artists after that period rely on the Golden Legend for all of these accounts of the Virgin's life.
That third scene in particular is very surprising because the resurrection appearances of Jesus never involve Mary in the biblical accounts. And yet, I think as often, these legendary stories can still carry enormous religious meaning. And that one in particular reminds us of the huge importance and intimacy of the relationship between the two. And we're going to see that a great deal through these films. And it has a lot to do with the extraordinary fact that she's a virgin mother. She does marry. She marries Joseph, who we see sort of nodding off here in the first panel. But the fact that she's a virgin mother is both an enormously important fact in the Christian tradition, but also a very puzzling one. Why does she need to be a virgin? And of course, there are lots of potential answers to that. One has to do with, I suppose, the nature of God, that God can do this, and that in some way the specialness of Jesus' life is marked out at both ends by the fact that a womb that shouldn't be full is filled by the power of God, and a tomb that shouldn't be empty is emptied by the power of God. And we see that empty tomb in the distance there. So it tells us something about God's action and the specialness of Jesus. But it also, I think, has a lot to do with Mary herself. This is the language God has chosen to communicate himself to the world, this woman's body. And it's a body whole and complete in itself. It has everything it needs in order to give humanity to Jesus. Just as in the original Garden of Eden stories in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, the story begins with one figure, maybe these days controversially a man, Adam, from whom everything else follows. Here, the new story of a new creation, of a world made new, begins with one figure again, and it's a woman.
What's fascinating about so many of these representations of the Virgin Mary is how much they differ. So according to the location of where the work was made, the time period, the sources that an artist is drawing on, we might see the Virgin portrayed completely differently. So she might have dark skin and dark hair in one tradition, or she might have very fair skin and blonde hair in another tradition. And each one of these speaks very directly to the community for which it was intended to address.
Yes, I mean, she's even differently clothed, even in this one work here. And she acquired huge range of names, some of them derived from scripture, some of them brought in from elsewhere. And many of the great prayers of the Christian tradition name her in long litanies. And there are over 50 such names. They include things like Queen of Heaven, the Ark of the Covenant, the Mystic Rose, and the Seat of Wisdom. So a whole variety of different names, and we could go on and on.
And actually, the Seat of Wisdom is a really fascinating one, and there is a beautiful work in the Bode-Museum, and I'd like to show you that one now. Ben, this is the sculpture I immediately thought of in the Bode-Museum when you mentioned that one title of the Virgin as the Throne of Wisdom. Because as you can see here in this wood carving, the Virgin is represented seated on a throne, and in fact she's got the Christ child on her lap. So in fact she's functioning as a throne. What's really handy here is that this artist has included a whole number of inscriptions. So we know that it was carved by an artist called Presbyter Martinus in 1199. And we also know that it belonged to a church in the town of Borgo San Sepolcro. So that's a town near Arezzo in Italy. And actually that elongated shape of the sculpture makes me think of how it's been carved from a trunk of wood, and that it probably originally was attached to a pilaster in the church and sort of intended to project out of that piece of architecture. In addition to the inscription of the date and the artist's name, it specifically refers to this type of iconography as the Virgin as the Sedes Sapientiae, so that's the Latin name for Throne of Wisdom.
That's fascinating, because the throne itself is an echo, it seems to me, of the throne that one of the great ancient Israelite kings, King Solomon, sat upon. He was the king who built the first temple in Jerusalem, and he was famed for his wisdom. And his throne is described in the Bible as being decorated with lions, and they seem to be echoed here in these two little lions at the base. So if we already have this visual association with a biblical throne on which a very wise king once sat, we then have a new layer added to it here, because the Virgin is on a throne, as Solomon would have been, but she also is supporting the Christ child, who in Christian tradition is sometimes himself named as wisdom, wisdom personified, the wisdom of God. And the full sentence in that inscription at the top is, I think, in the lap of the mother shines out the wisdom of the Father meaning God the Father, the Father in heaven. So this divine wisdom radiating outwards, presented by the Virgin, radiating outwards through the Son, who almost accentuates this forward movement by his sort of flung out arm.
Blessing gesture.
Yeah.
In many ways, the outward-facing nature of this work and the way it engages the beholder and the way the Christ child really reaches out to bless us, the beholder standing in front of the sculpture, is quite distinct from the Miraflores altarpiece that we just looked at in the Gemäldegalerie, where the artist is really focusing on the relationship between the Virgin Mary and her son Jesus. This sculpture makes me think of how the artist wants to engage the beholder in front of the artwork. And in fact, that's what we're going to be doing in this whole series, aren't we? We're going to look at how artists used representations of the Virgin Mary to engage their audiences.